about. All right, first half is done, second half is up. The first speaker we will listen to now is Professor Fernando Reimers, and he will actually not be joining us. He's from Harvard, if I'm not completely wrong here. International Education, Director of Global Education Innovation Initiative as well. And I know that he's been doing a lot of work together with UNESCO when it comes to teaching as well. So we will actually listen to him instead. He will be joining us here on screen and talk about the future of education from his perspective. So let's just listen to him, and after that it's time for Dr. Vijay Kumar to come up on stage as well from MIT, giving his insights as well. So those are the two ones, but we take one at a time. We start with Professor Fernando Reimers.
My name is Fernando Reimers, and I am the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. And I am delighted to participate virtually at this Congress on Educational Innovation taking place in Latvia. I wish I could be with you in person, but I'm very grateful for the opportunities that technology affords us to communicate in this way. I'm going to talk about the recently published report by UNESCO, written by the International Commission on the Futures of Education. And I want to begin that report, given that this is a conference that is involving people in a conversation around educational innovation, around imagination, creativity, with this reproduction of a canvas by Claude Monet. And I want to use that reproduction not only because it's a beautiful painting and because I happen to like Monet's work, but because it is an allegory of the importance of staying on the power of the imagination at difficult time. As you know, Monet painted a number of his canvases in World War I. And as the troops were coming to Giverny, just outside Paris, where he was living, his neighbors were urging him to leave because he could hear the bombs, and he had been painting hearing the bombs over Paris. And Monet's response was, I will stay here anyway. And if those barbarians want to kill me, I will die among my canvases in front of my life's work. And the resonance of Monet's ideas at that time of great violence today is very clear. With a completely unjustified aggression on Ukraine ordered by President Vladimir Putin, basically an expression of the challenges that remain around the world to the basic idea of human rights, the rights of people to even define their nationality, whether they are a nation. And what you have here is the use of brute force, violating all international conventions, simply because one man does not recognize the right of a people to exist, to be who they are. But in this context, I find the work of Monet inspiring because it is a call not just to reason, but to imagination, to the work of the heart, to focus on what is positive and good and beautiful and just. And education is our canvas. Now, in part, education is our canvas because at another time of terrible violence, World War II this time, at the end of World War II, a number of people, world leaders in that case, look back and ask, how did we let this violence happen? How were 6 million people, how did this genocide of the Jewish people take place under our noses, under our watch? And they basically said, why don't we frame a compact, a document that recognizes that people have some basic rights just because they are human. And we then commit to trying to achieve those rights. It's a beautiful creation, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in December of 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, because it is both an expression of the recognition of our interdependence, of how none of us will fully achieve their humanity if we don't engage in helping others achieve their own humanity. And that act of imagination that creation, represented in each of the 30 rights in the Universal Declaration, essentially transform the world. And an example of that is what the right of education, reflected in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration, did for humanity. Because at the moment when the Declaration was adopted, 1948, there were 2.5 billion humans on this planet, of which about 40%, 2 in 5, had ever set foot in a school. And today, less than 8 decades after that moment, when there are 8 billion humans on this planet, well over 90%, more than 9 in 10 humans, have not only set foot in a school, but have spent in school a considerable period of their lives. And this, in my view, is one of the most significant silent revolutions that humanity has experienced. And it all began with an act of creativity, of imagination. It began recognizing that education was a human right and that we all had to collaborate in helping every member of our species achieve that right. That act, that bold act of imagination, essentially rewrote the cultural DNA of humanity. And it is on that achievement that we now build. It is on that achievement, on the realization of the basic right of education, that we can now have conversations about what should those years that people spend in school be about. And of course, one of the agencies that was created to help achieve this right was the United Nations Education, Science, and Culture Organization, UNESCO, that basically tried to inspire, tried to persuade, tried to mobilize, tried to remind governments of their moral obligation of achieving this right. And so I want to talk about this recent publication by that very organization, UNESCO, titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. Now, the report is structured in 3 sections. The first section, containing 2 chapters, talks about what are some of these big challenges that we face. And it does talk about climate change, an existential challenge for humanity. It talks about a challenge to the idea of human rights, a powerful idea that has been the cornerstone of the world order since World War II, and that it is increasingly under attack. Most recently, an attack expressed in the aggression in the war on Ukraine, against Ukraine. Third set of challenges, the challenges of democratic governance, the fragility of democracy, the declining numbers of democracy, the declining signs of vitality of democracies around the world, even in some of the oldest democracies in the world. The challenges related to artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is contributing to the creation of social media that segregate humans, bringing us into echo chambers where we only hear people who think like us, but making it more difficult to reach out across differences to people who have diverse views and with whom, at the end of the day, we need to come together and agree if we're going to live together, if we're going to coexist on the same social contract. So that's the first section of the report. The second section of the report talks about what are the educational changes that need to take place. And I'll be describing them in just a moment. This report gets inside educational institutions to a greater extent than the 2 previous reports and talks about the need to transform the very culture of education, the very idea of what education is, to what ends, and how it should be done. The basic ideas on which this report is framed are that everyone is an agent of change, that when it comes to transforming the culture of education, what the student does, how she understands education, is as important as what the teacher thinks or as what the Minister of Education thinks. And they all need to be involved in this conversation about how should we align education with the most crucial challenges of our times. The second key idea on which this report rests is the notion that educational institutions have to intentionally align with the preservation of the notion of human dignity, of the notion that people have certain rights just because they are, just because they exist, that humans are not a means to an end. They're an end in and of themselves, and that they have certain rights regardless of any other dimension that defines their identity. And the third key idea on which this report is based is the idea that learning has to be authentic and relevant. Authentic in helping students understand the connection between what they learn and the world outside the school. Relevant in helping students understand the connection between what they're learning and the things that they value, the values that animate them, that give their life purpose. Now, to transform the culture of education in the report means to reimagine pedagogy, curriculum, the very organization of schools, the very idea of who is a teacher and how teaching should be done, the teaching profession, and the larger ecosystem of learning. And so, in order to transform those 5 elements of change, the report proposes 4 levers that are going to help us reimagine these elements of change, which are all interdependent of one another. In other words, the teaching profession needs to be transformed on behalf of making it possible to deliver a reimagined curriculum through new pedagogies. The organization of school needs to be reimagined on behalf of enabling a new way of thinking about the profession so that it can support new pedagogy and so on. The 4 catalytic actions are knowledge, expert knowledge, the product of research and innovation. This report is an invitation to much greater investments in research produced by a much wider range of actors and of innovation. The second, as I mentioned, is this participatory dialogue that involves everybody in conversations about how do we resonate with the report's discussion of the biggest challenges that we face, and what are the implications of those challenges for what we're teaching in our educational institution. If we want education to be authentic and relevant to those challenges, what do we need to do the same, better, or different? Third catalytic action is much greater engagement of universities with the rest of the educational ecosystem, including elementary, secondary schools, and other educational institutions. And the last set of catalytic actions is a reimagined architecture of international cooperation. Basic notion of reimagining pedagogy is to go beyond helping individuals gain skills that help them as individuals into developing the capacities that help people collaborate. And so a pedagogy organized around the principles of cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity that cultivates not only cognitive intellectual skills, but social, ethical competencies that allow people to work together and to transform the world with empathy and with compassion. And that helps them recognize and unlearn biases, prejudices that are the foundation of division and of the social fragmentation that so undermines coexistence. Second idea on the transformation of the culture of education is to reimagine the curriculum. To reimagine a curriculum that helps us understand our ecological impact, that helps us develop intercultural capacities, that helps us bring together the knowledge from different disciplines so that students can both access knowledge but also contribute to knowledge and criticize and recognize the limits, the biases in knowledge. To reimagine the teaching profession is to replace the mental model that sees the teacher as an atlas holding the world on her shoulders for a profession that is a lot more collaborative, team-based, where teachers can collaborate with their peers, not only within their own educational institutions, but across educational institutions and across various types of institutions. To reimagine schools is to recognize that there are some problems that cannot be resolved at the unit of a school. The school is too small. If we want to produce the most effective, the most transformational climate change curriculum and pedagogy, it's not realistic to assume that a group of teachers in a school, no matter how well prepared, no matter how large the school, can do that. Because the most current, the best knowledge on climate change is in universities, in chemistry departments, in physics departments. But also, we need the humanities and the social sciences in the universities to help us design transformational curriculum that not only develop understanding of the problem, but also develop the imagination and the capacity to behave in ways individually and collectively that will do something else. And that requires that we think of schools as institutions that are nested within networks in frequent collaboration with other schools, but also with other educational institutions such as universities, workplaces, cultural institutions. And lastly, reimagining the culture of education is articulating, connecting the dots of the larger educational ecosystem to guarantee the right to learn with quality throughout life. And to produce that reimagination, the catalysts for change are, as I mentioned, a call for research and innovation, and solidarity and cooperation, a reimagined international architecture, and a much greater intentional role of universities connecting with schools to help them in the task of generating the expert knowledge that is going to help produce this transformation. And then social dialogue, democratic, participatory, inclusive dialogue that can help us reimagine education. The report, of course, as befits any document written for the entirety of humanity, is written at a high level of generality, of abstraction. And that means it requires to be translated into specific operational strategies that apply to concrete contexts, whether those contexts are the context of a school, of a university, of a network of schools, of a particular system. And this conference on innovation in Latvia, is a unique opportunity, a privileged opportunity to develop, to carry out those conversations about what do the ideas of this report on the futures of education mean specifically for a reimagined education in Latvia. I want to provide 3 examples of how this report can be translated into specific context as a result of the kind of solidarity and collaboration that the report calls for. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see a recent publication that contains the work of my graduate students at Harvard. See, last fall, I invited the graduate students in a course on education policy that I teach to read the report and to work in partnership with education authorities in several education jurisdictions and organizations, with municipal secretaries of education, state secretaries of education, national ministers of education, leaders of non-governmental organizations working in education, and networks of private schools. And what these teams of students did over the course of a semester was to discuss with their counterparts the key ideas in the report and then ask the question, how do those ideas resonate in this particular context, in this particular system? And to what extent is the functioning of this system, the programmatic priorities of these systems, the structures of this system align with developing, with constructing the opportunities for authentic and meaningful learning, align with these challenges the report talks about? And what could be reimagined? What could be done differently? And so these teams wrote a chapter each that basically proposes an educational strategy that is an invitation to much wider debate in those particular jurisdictions. And so we put together those reports in this book, which is now the first book that contains a set of concrete education strategies to advance the ideas in UNESCO's report in particular jurisdictions. The report is both meant as an exemplar of how to translate the ideas on the Futures of Education report, but it's also an invitation. Imagine if each of the 28,000 universities around the world engage a group of students just like I did in doing something similar over the next 6 months. We would have, before the end of the year, more concrete operational strategies to translate education systems the world over at all levels, public and private, than the entirety of the strategies that have been produced by all international development organizations together since the UN system was established after World War II. And that is a way to exemplify the idea contained in this report that universities need to reimagine their own involvement as levers of change of the entirety of the education system. Because if they engage their own students and faculty in solidarity with the rest of the system in the task of reimagining an education system, we can accelerate the process of transformation of the culture of education. So let me invite those of you in the audience to consider the possibility that universities in Latvia could engage their own students and faculty with this report, not just for the purpose of reimagining the functioning of the universities themselves, but doing this work in partnership with education systems in cities, in states, in provinces, in the country, to reimagine those systems. The second example of how to translate this general report written for the entirety of humanity into concrete operational strategies is the result of work of the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which I lead at Harvard University with partners all over the world, in partnership in a collaboration with the International Bureau of Education for UNESCO in Geneva. And what we did in this case was to look at some of the educational innovations that had emerged in the context of the COVID pandemic through the ideas contained in the report. And we asked the question, to what extent did some of these innovations already reflect these ideas about the future of education? In other words, rather than look at the pandemic as a moment of tremendous learning loss and as a moment of tremendous pain and cost in the education system, we looked at the pandemic as potentially the cradle of innovation that anticipated the education systems of the future. And we said, let's document some of these innovations and explain how those ideas already exemplify the principles of the future of education, of a reimagined pedagogy, curriculum, teaching profession, organization of schools and learning ecosystem contained in the report. And the report, Learning to Build Back Better Futures for Education, contains 31 innovations. And it's again both an example of 31 case studies, which could be an opportunity for discussion in a variety of contexts. But more importantly, it's an invitation to others to similarly take stock of existing innovations, whether they took place in the pandemic or not, and then use them to basically ask what elements of this vision of the futures of education are already here. Now, let me conclude this presentation suggesting something very specific that any one of you working in an educational institution in Latvia, whether it's a school or a high school or a university, could do to help produce these concrete operational strategies to enact the ideas of this report in your context for the purpose of using essentially the levers of research and innovation and participatory dialogue to reimagine at least pedagogy, curriculum, the organization of school and the teaching profession, and perhaps the larger learning ecosystem. The idea is that you convene a conversation, that you identify within your institution a group of leaders of the process of change within your institution, including students as well as faculty, as well as administrators, and that you read the report. You read this report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, and you discuss, obviously this could be done over several sessions, even several weeks, and you discuss the resonance of those ideas in your particular context. Read what the report says about climate change and what it demands of us, and from your vantage point in your locality, discuss to what extent are these issues also issues of concern for us, to what extent are they priority issues. Look at this report in its discussion of the challenges to human rights, to democratic governance, and in your context, discuss to what extent do we resonate with these issues, to what extent do we have other issues. And then look at the proposal in this report of what it would mean to reimagine the culture of education, reimagining pedagogy, curriculum, the teaching profession, the very organization of schools, the larger ecosystem, and ask yourselves,
To what extent are you already doing things in your institution that are very much aligned with that report? What do you need to continue doing? What do you need to accelerate, to do better, perhaps to scale? What should you be doing anew? What are you not currently doing that you should be? So engage in those dialogues and then identify what are the challenges that you face in your context? What are the barriers that are preventing you from building that future of education? And then collectively design a solution, design a prototype, invent. This is the time for creativity, for innovation. Generate some prototypes of change and then experiment with them. Carry them out, evaluate them, and then learn, capture what you learn from that evaluation and share it not only within your institution but with others. It is this very simple system of going from identifying challenges inspired by the report, generating solutions, experimenting with them, evaluating them, and sharing that knowledge, that the report argues should be taking place in every educational institution with the aims of transforming the core elements of the culture of education. And the report simply is trying to provide a framing set of ideas, a common language that would make it possible for educational institutions as they engage in this process of innovation, experimentation, and research to share what they learn with others and to learn from what others are doing. In this way, building education networks that make it possible to accelerate the creation of the specific knowledge that translates these ideas of the report into concrete strategies for your particular institution. I hope you have found these ideas of some value and that at a minimum they have inspired you to go and read the report and to not just think about this report alone, but to engage your colleagues in a discussion of what these ideas could mean in your context. Because the basic hope of the Commission is that this report is the beginning of that conversation where each one of you are really the most important actors in this process of co-constructing the specific strategies that would help you produce the future of education right where you are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today.
There we go. He doesn't hear it, but we can give him an applause anyway, can we? Yes. Now I can send my regards and say that we did. So there we have it. All right, thank you so much for that. Let's go to the next.